analysis, your prognosis, more than in 1979 in new material, that means that you have at least another 40 plus million cubic meters to come out.
Yes.
All right.
Quite a little ways to go still.
Yes.
That's it. That's the point. So
yes.
I don't think people, I mean, there might be possible then during reports coming up that we say that there's a lull or there's a pause. I don't think people should take that to mean that it's finished. It's still early days yet. And I mean, it's probably a good thing that you know, we got this, we got it slightly wrong yesterday because it shows how uncertain this thing is. It still seems to us that it's following a general pattern, but you know, the details of that pattern might need a little tweaking as we go along, and therefore, you know, people need to avoid. I think the main thing is that people need to stay out of those areas. They're still very high risk. There's still things in there that could kill you. And even though there's an interval between explosions, I don't think people should now start thinking that every time an explosion, you could try to get in during the gap, because the gap might change as it just did, and we're not exactly sure how it will change. There's certain margin of error that people need to understand with these systems that requires us to be very careful with how we respond to them.
May I ask something else too, Richie? Yeah. I saw a report. I didn't hear you myself, and I didn't hear what any quote-unquote United Kingdom scientist said. But I saw a report which suggested that it was being said that it is a possibility that this volcano can return to prehistoric condition. That is to say, to make St. Vincent a desert. Is that, what is this? I mean, I know a number of things coming out. Is this, for A, was that said or meant to be interpreted in that way? Or B, if there is a possibility, is it a fanciful possibility as distinct from a real one? Because when things are being said like this, we have to clarify.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think I have also said it too before, that soufre has ways of erupting that in prehistoric times was much more significant than now. And I think I've described some of the ways it's erupted. You know, people saw the intense way it erupted in the early sort of first couple of days of this eruption. Soufre has the capacity, from the rock record that we have, from looking at the deposits, to have periods like that extend for longer time. That is that you have, and therefore the result of that is that you produce a lot of ash, and we know that ash is a problem if it gets excessive, as it is now. There's never an absolute negative in the sense that we can say no, something like that or those kinds of eruptions can never happen again. But so far we're tracking the eruption, and so far we think that the most likely thing is for it to continue behaving like it's behaving now, which is similar to what it has behaved in the historic past. So the scale that we expect is one of that. And I've drawn the comparison with, it's looking like it's bigger than 79, it's closer to 1902. We don't see anything yet that tells us that it's heading to something different than that. And if anything, there's evidence given recent studies that it tends to have more frequent eruptions. In fact, up until this one, which is bigger than the last one, you would have thought that it looks like the more frequent eruptions were of lower magnitude. So 1902 was bigger than 1971 and then 1971 or 79. So you would have expected that this would be smaller, but it's now gone slightly bigger. So to answer your question in sort of in brief, is that there's no indication currently that soufre is heading towards a prehistoric scale kind of activity. It seems to be operating still within the parameters of what we expect it to do historically.
At 1902, from what you said, that this is closer to 1902.
Yeah, that's far. And I mean, as soon as we see any indication of that, we'll alert the public, alert the government.
Yes.
And we don't see any indication of anything changing. So, I mean, I don't know why that was said. The context, it might be that the context in which it was said was taken out. One can speak about possible things from volcanoes. Volcanoes have things that are less likely, things that are most likely, and the actual thing that happened. So if the things that are less likely tend to be of a larger magnitude, the rare events, the things that are more likely tend to be things that are probably tend to be things that are probably a smaller magnitude than the rare events, which tend to be bigger. And maybe the person was describing what the possibilities were, and the journalist might have taken it as then saying that this is what it's heading for. I don't know what it is, but I would have to see the context, and that's possibly the case.
Well, you know, Richie, when you explain things the way you do, and when I hear and read what Seismic Research Center says, I am moved in your own case, and I don't want you to be modest about this, is that you're a greater, richer than the rest of the tribe, because it is I'm borrowing from Shakespeare. It is invaluable scientific work you're doing for us and explaining it in layman's language. Occasionally there may be a misunderstanding here or there, and that's why we need to correct them. Now, when you study volcanoes, and like you say, it's close to the 1902, as a scientist, a geologist, a seismologist, do you look also at the social and economic consequences historically following particular eruptions? Like, for instance, in 1902, where it appears, and I don't know whether your study is involved, is that the economy in the north, the northern one-third, was significantly altered, and the migration patterns, we saw a lot of people leaving the area and settling south. Of course, in the remainder of the 20th century, after things had settled down, people, the population increased and so on and so forth. Some people went back, but and naturally, the natural increase in population is this. And in 1979, we also saw migration. Clearly, people who had come into shelters, gone into homes, significant numbers stayed. Is that from the history of the eruptions? Is that the kind of pattern that you have seen? If you, in fact, as part of your formal study, study the socio-economic and migratory patterns consequent upon eruptions.
Yeah, I mean, I have had, and Seismic has had many collaborations with colleagues, some great scientists overseas, and one of the things that, yes, you're correct. One of the things that we've looked at is not just the physical volcanology involved in processes regarding super, but one of the things that I'm interested in terms of from a research perspective, and colleagues in the UK at the University of East Anglia, at Bristol University, we have worked on looking at volcanism and how people deal with volcanoes in a sort of a rounded way, not just what the volcano does, but how people respond to them. So there's a lot of research that has gone on, through the oral tradition in the context of what people say about volcanoes, but also some of the things that you mentioned. And one of the things I'll tell you, you're correct. One of the things I'll tell you is that some of the settlement patterns in St. Vincent now, so where people live currently, is as a direct result of what happened in 1902. So I believe communities, and we did a project recently, and we actually brought that back to St. Vincent. We collaborated with NEMO and created an exhibition for St. Vincent. People like Professor Barkley in UEA and various others in the UK. We worked on creating an exhibition which would give back to Vincentians the knowledge that we had acquired. And one of the things, I remember there's a graphic in it that shows you the settlements in St. Vincent in 1902, and there's a graphic that shows you where people went as a result, because the authorities then moved people, relocated people who were on the volcano to certain communities. And there's a graphic that shows you where certain villages are, where they are now. So for example, I'll tell you specifically. For example, the villages of places like Camden Park, Rosebank, a couple others like that, were created actually because people had to move, and there were people who were resettled. So you could actually track that, and we actually have in the exhibition what happened in 1902, and in fact, what has happened at volcanoes and other hazards. People tend to have to move, and you could track it, and you could trace not just the migration patterns where they go, but also you could trace how St. Vincent's geography and where the settlement patterns are has been affected by what the volcano has done. Essentially, people have moved from the north, and some of the communities that you have in the south now, where could trace their origin from in the north, and it affected how people were evacuated in 79. A lot of the evacuation in the early days of 79 happened because people had relatives in the south and simply went to people who were living in the south had relatives in the north, and they simply got in the vehicle and went to the north, and that's how they voluntarily, a lot of evacuation in the early days. Unlike this time where it was called and it was organized in a certain way. Last time, at the beginning, the eruption started and people just started to move. And a lot of the movement was facilitated by relatives who went and got their relatives who were living in the north. So yes, it's happened. And it's one of the things that we look at, because to understand how people deal with volcanoes and to better sort of inform the advice and the information you provide. Persons like myself and other colleagues at the Seismic Center have looked at it in that kind of way, not just what the volcano is doing, which is straight science. Some of us are interested in that, but some of us are interested in it in a wider perspective.
I raise this, Richie, because as you will see already, my mind is turning towards the issue of recovery and reconstruction. And one obvious thing would be the physical infrastructure in relation, for instance, housing.
Yeah.
Because that is a matter which has to be given great thought as a consequence of our experiences, and there can be certain reconfiguration in certain communities as a result of the migration, and thus housing, health, services, all kind of other things in areas which may have an influx of somewhat more persons.
Yeah. So I mean, to say that, I'll say that there's historical precedent for this.
If Lady Sophia says, "Hey guys, the Richie and Ralph show has to go back on the road because there's something which has happened and which demands the immediate attention." So I just wanted to raise that and ask.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think we, as I'm here as part of a team that providing advice, and to you as the head of the government, about to inform people about what we do. We have a great education outreach team that produce products all the time. But one of the things that we do, and I'm not doing